It finally happened. The King just shook the entire UK government to its core, and what followed may end Keir Starmer's career faster than anyone thought possible. In the corridors of power, whispers turned into panic when King Charles did something no one in Westminster ever imagined. He spoke his mind. Not through palisades, not through subtle symbolism, but in his own words, sharp, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. During what was supposed to be a routine briefing with senior ministers, the King reportedly interrupted the discussion and said, "Britain cannot be governed by chaos disguised as leadership." One line. That's all it took. Within minutes, those 12 words were racing through Downing Street like a wildfire, and by the time Starmer heard them, the damage was already done. Witnesses say the Prime Minister froze, then demanded to know if the comment was real. His aides confirmed it came directly from Buckingham Palace. The atmosphere inside Number 10 shifted instantly. Confusion turned to fury. Ministers who once defended him now whispered that he had lost control, not just of Parliament, but of the monarchy itself. And let's be clear, in British politics, when the King begins to sound like the voice of reason, the Prime Minister's days are numbered. Insiders say Starmer's response was volcanic. He called an emergency cabinet meeting, stormed into the room without a word, and slammed a folder onto the table so hard that it startled everyone. One minister later said it was like watching a man realise he'd just lost the crown without even knowing he was playing for it. But here's the real kicker. That folder, the one Starmer slammed down, contained reports of secret meetings between senior civil servants and royal advisors. The palace wasn't just concerned about government instability. They were preparing for what one source called a constitutional safeguard. Translation: the monarchy was quietly planning for a future without Starmer. For a government that built its reputation on control, this was humiliation on a royal scale. Every major news outlet pounced on the story. The headlines were brutal. The King speaks, the PM trembles. Social media turned it into a digital battlefield. Hashtag King vs Starmer trended across platforms and memes spread like wildfire. One viral post showed the King sitting calmly in Windsor, sipping tea, under the caption, "Ruling without ruling? The Royal Masterclass." Starmer's image, meanwhile, became a symbol of weakness. He was no longer the confident reformer. He was the man who angered the crown. But how did it get this far? Insiders trace it back to a string of quiet frustrations at Buckingham Palace. For months, the King had watched as the government stumbled from scandal to scandal, and public anger over rising prices, infighting in Parliament, and growing unrest across the nation. While Starmer preached unity, his cabinet was fractured and his relationship with the palace had become icy. Royal aides described him as dismissive and tone-deaf. A man too focused on optics to understand the institution he was trampling on. Charles, who has spent his life balancing duty and restraint, had finally reached his breaking point. The King's comment at those 12 carefully chosen words, but it wasn't an accident, it was a message. Some even believe it was a warning, a subtle but unmistakable declaration that the crown still holds power, even in silence, and Starmer knew it. Within hours, he ordered his team to prepare an official statement, hoping to calm the storm. But by then, the narrative had escaped his control. Palace insiders, political rivals, even foreign journalists, everyone was talking about the same thing. Had King Charles just intervened in politics, or had Starmer's arrogance forced the monarch to step in? Meanwhile, across Britain, the public reaction was unlike anything the government had expected. Older generations cheered the King's courage, calling him the voice of the people. Younger voters, disillusioned by endless political spin, began to see the monarchy in a new light. Not as a relic, but as the last institution still capable of telling the truth. And that terrified Downing Street. The balance of power, centuries old and carefully protected, was beginning to tilt, and Starmer could feel it slipping through his fingers. But the real shock was still to come, because behind closed doors... So who was this mystery guest who sat across from the King while the government burned? And did Charles just set in motion the biggest political twist in modern British history? The answer will leave Westminster trembling, and that's where the story truly begins. Hours after the King's words sent shockwaves through Westminster, the air in Downing Street turned toxic. Ministers moved like ghosts, Aides avoided eye contact and reporters camped outside the gates waiting for any sign of collapse. Inside the palace, however, calm reigned. King Charles had returned to his usual schedule, a quiet meeting here, a charity briefing there, as if the political earthquake outside his walls had nothing to do with him. But everyone knew better. That single remark had thrown the government into chaos, and the silence that followed it was louder than any speech. The British monarchy had just reminded the world that it doesn't need to shout to be heard. While the press dissected every possible meaning behind the King's sentence, one name began to appear in whispers and online leaks: Nigel Farage. The man, once dismissed as a political entertainer, had suddenly become the subject of late-night calls between nervous MPs and anxious donors. According to multiple sources, Farage had quietly met the King just days before the alleged comment. Officially, it was described as a private discussion on national unity. Unofficially, it was a masterstroke. Farage, who had built his entire career on defying political convention, had managed to do what no one else dared. He had the ear of the monarch when the Prime Minister didn't. The implications were staggering. If true, it meant that the palace was entertaining ideas from the opposition. Not the official one, but the populist outsider. It wasn't treason, but it was close enough to send Westminster into a panic. Starmer's advisors, sensing an existential threat, started briefing journalists that the King had been misled by right-wing agitators. It was a desperate attempt to control the narrative, but it only made things worse. The public didn't see a reckless monarch. They saw a Prime Minister trying to silence the crown. Memes flooded social media again, this time with Farage and the King photoshopped as unlikely allies under the caption, "The Tea Party that terrified Downing Street." By the next morning, Parliament was in uproar. Opposition MPs demanded an inquiry into whether the King had overstepped his role. Labour loyalists defended Starmer, but their words sounded hollow even to their own voters. Every poll showed the same result. Public sympathy lay with the King. "He's just saying what we all think," one caller said on a radio show that morning. The government's lost the plot and someone needed to remind them who they serve. It was a devastating blow to a Prime Minister who had built his reputation on being the adult in the room. Now he was being painted as the child who'd misbehaved in front of his father. Behind the scenes, the Labour Party was splitting apart. Rachel Reeves reportedly told close allies that the King's patience is a reflection of the nation's. Angela Rayner, ever the strategist, began holding quiet meetings with senior MPs about what she called a transition plan. No one used the word coup, but everyone knew what was coming. Ministers began drafting resignation letters, waiting for the right moment to strike. The irony was painful. The man who'd promised to restore stability was now the source of the greatest instability in a generation. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage wasted no time capitalising on the chaos. At a press conference outside Reform UK headquarters, he smiled like a man who already knew history was on his side. When the foundations of a nation shake, he said, you find out who's built on truth and who's built on lies. It was a direct jab at Starmer, but the brilliance lay in its tone. Calm, composed, even statesmanlike. For once, Farage didn't need to shout. The world was already listening. Within hours, Reform UK's membership tripled, small donations poured in, and pundits began asking the unthinkable question, could Nigel Farage actually become Prime Minister? Starmer's response only made things worse. In a hastily arranged press conference, he tried to project authority but ended up sounding defensive. The monarchy remains above politics, he declared, and I have the utmost respect for His Majesty. But the smirk he gave afterward betrayed irritation, not respect. The clip went viral in seconds, and the comment sections were merciless. Inside Buckingham Palace, advisors urged the King to issue a clarifying statement, a polite reminder of his constitutional neutrality. But Charles refused. The truth, he reportedly said, does not need clarification. Those around him say it was the calm of a man who'd spent decades preparing for a moment like this, not to seize power, but to protect the nation from those who'd forgotten what power really means. And in that silence, Starmer's downfall gathered speed. Every interview, every headline, every poll painted the same picture. A monarch standing tall and a Prime Minister sinking fast. But then came the leak that no one expected. A single memo dated 2 weeks before the King's alleged remarks, signed by one of Starmer's senior aides. The title? Managing the Monarchy Narrative. Its contents would shake the public's faith in the government more than anything before, because buried in those pages was evidence that Downing Street had been planning to modernise the monarchy's role in state affairs. A euphemism that sounded dangerously close to stripping the crown of its influence altogether, and that's when the question shifted from whether Starmer could survive to whether the monarchy itself was under attack. But if the King knew about that memo before his fateful comment, what did he plan to do next? Was his silence just patience, or preparation for something far more explosive? By the time the leaked memo hit the front pages, Britain was already on edge. But its contents turned anxiety into outrage, and the document, cold and bureaucratic in tone, outlined a plan for what Starmer's aides called a redefinition of constitutional balance. In plain English, it meant curbing the monarchy's ability to influence national affairs, reducing the King to little more than a ceremonial figurehead who signed documents and smiled for cameras. It wasn't treason, but for millions of Britons, it might as well have been. The revelations spread across the country like a contagion. Newspapers ran it as the lead story. Talk shows buzzed with fury. Even royal commentators who normally avoided politics called it a dangerous assault on tradition. For a prime minister already accused of arrogance, this was the final nail in the coffin. Within hours, the palace's usually measured calm began to tremble beneath the surface. Aides scrambled to manage the public perception while carefully avoiding any appearance of direct political retaliation. Yet one anonymous insider told reporters that the King was deeply hurt, not just by the disrespect to his office, but by what it represented, a deliberate attempt to sever Britain from the stability that had carried it through centuries of turmoil. He feels betrayed, the source said simply, and not just personally. Those words were enough to send chills through Westminster. If the King felt betrayed, what would he do next? Meanwhile, Starmer's team was in meltdown. Downing Street descended into chaos, phones ringing non-stop, staff resigning mid-shift, senior advisors disappearing without explanation. One eyewitness described the atmosphere as a funeral with fluorescent lighting. Inside the Cabinet Office, arguments erupted about who leaked the memo. Some blamed a rogue aide, others suspected someone in the palace. But one chilling theory began to circulate. The leak came from inside Labour itself. A few ambitious MPs, desperate to distance themselves from a sinking ship, had allegedly handed the document to the press as part of a coordinated effort to force Starmer out. If that was true, the coup had already begun. While Starmer fought for his political life, the King's image only grew stronger. Across the nation, spontaneous vigils appeared outside royal landmarks, Windsor, Sandringham, even outside Buckingham Palace itself. People held candles, waved Union Jacks, and chanted, "Defend the Crown." It wasn't organised by any group or party. It was organic, emotional, and utterly damning for the government. Every chant, every post, every photograph told the same story. The people were with their king, not their prime minister. Foreign media couldn't look away. American anchors called it the most British coup imaginable, fought with leaks, headlines and polite fury. In France, newspapers mocked Starmer as le premier ministre sans royaume, the prime minister without a kingdom. Even Australia's parliament debated the scandal, with one MP saying if Britain abandons its monarchy, it abandons itself. Starmer's international credibility evaporated overnight. The man who once promised to restore Britain's global standing had become its greatest embarrassment. Behind the scenes, Angela Rayner was making her move. Long known for her political instincts, she quietly gathered a coalition of disillusioned MP, the same ones who'd lost faith in Starmer's leadership weeks earlier. In hushed meetings and encrypted group chats, they began drafting letters of no confidence. The plan was simple: strike fast of feast, replace him before the crisis spiralled into full constitutional collapse, and present the coup as an act of national rescue. Rachel Reeves, calculating as ever, didn't join the plot, but didn't stop it either. She simply waited to see which way the wind would blow, and while Westminster ate itself alive, the King remained silent. That silence once again became his greatest weapon. The contrast between his composure and Starmer's unravelling couldn't have been sharper. The Prime Minister raged, pleaded, denied. The monarch stood still, dignified, untouchable. Every hour, the king said nothing. His moral authority grew. Commentators called it the art of royal warfare. A battle fought not with armies or decrees, but with restraint. And yet, behind palace walls, something was stirring. The king had begun meeting with his private council, consulting legal and constitutional advisors about a set of emergency powers so ancient they were considered ceremonial relics. The royal prerogative. The very mention of it sent Westminster into panic. The royal prerogative includes the power to dissolve Parliament, dismiss ministers, and even appoint a temporary caretaker government, powers no monarch had used in modern times. Was Charles actually considering it? Officially, no one could confirm. Unofficially, the rumour alone was enough to terrify Downing Street. A monarch willing to flex such authority could rewrite Britain's constitutional playbook in a single stroke. As the night fell over London, the mood in the capital turned electric. Protesters surrounded Parliament, waving signs that read "King and Country" and "Starmer must go." The police lined the streets, pedestrians prepared for unrest but unsure what side they were protecting. Inside number 10, Sayen Starmer stood at his window, watching the crowds chant for a king who hadn't even spoken. In that moment, he must have realised that his government was no longer ruling Britain. It was surviving it. But then, just as the nation held its breath, a report emerged from the BBC claiming that a confidential royal letter had been sent directly to the Prime Minister earlier that day. No one knew its contents, no one even knew if it was real. Yet the rumour spread like wildfire. And within minutes, the question on every screen, in every newsroom, in every household was the same. Had the king just taken the first step toward removing his own prime minister? The morning after the mysterious royal letter rumour broke, Britain awoke in stunned silence. No one knew what the letter contained, but everyone felt its weight. Outside Buckingham Palace, cameras flashed, crowds gathered, and journalists speculated endlessly. The palace refused to comment. Downing Street denied receiving anything unconstitutional. And yet somehow every political insider in London whispered the same thing. The king had made his move. For a nation built on ritual and restraint, it felt like stepping into uncharted territory. The monarch, long dismissed as ceremonial, was now the most powerful man in the country, and the Prime Minister, once untouchable, looked like a tenant waiting for eviction. By midday, the tension reached breaking point. A leaked excerpt appeared online, allegedly from that very letter. It read simply, "The stability of the realm must come before the ambition of any man." No signature was shown, no proof was given, but it didn't matter. The line went viral within minutes, and Britain collectively gasped. Was it authentic? No one could say for sure, but every word sounded unmistakably royal. Precise, patient, devastatingly calm. For a leader already drowning in scandal, it was the final push beneath the surface. Inside number 10, aides described the Prime Minister as unreachable, pacing his office, muttering that he was the victim of a royal conspiracy. Some ministers begged him to resign gracefully before history humiliated him. He refused. "I answer to the people, not the crown," he reportedly said, the same line that centuries of fallen politicians had once believed before disappearing into history. Meanwhile, Angela Rayner's coup was no longer a whisper. It was an open rebellion. Late that afternoon, she and a coalition of Labour MPs filed a formal letter of no confidence, triggering an emergency meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Cameras caught her arriving at Westminster with a look that could only be described as resolute triumph. Her allies framed it not as treachery but as salvation. "The king has spoken for the people," one MP said, "and we are listening." Within hours, more than half of Labour's MPs signed on. The Prime Minister's majority evaporated like morning fog. Newsrooms across the world erupted. "Britain in constitutional meltdown," screamed the New York Times. Le Monde called it a royal earthquake. While the BBC interrupted regular programming to announce that Starmer would face an internal leadership vote by the end of the week. In one of the most surreal twists, even opposition leaders praised the King's restraint. The Conservative leader issued a carefully worded statement. His Majesty has acted within the spirit of his duty. Nigel Farage, ever the opportunist, appeared live on television that evening with the Union Jack behind him declaring, "When leaders lose their humility, the nation looks to the throne." It was political theatre at its most ruthless, and Farage played his part to perfection. As chaos consumed Westminster, the palace remained silent, but the silence itself became strategy. Every hour without a statement allowed the myth to grow. The wise monarch, quietly saving his nation from political ruin. Historians compared it to 1834, when King William IV dismissed his prime minister, but this time the stakes were higher. Britain wasn't merely debating policy, it was questioning its very identity. Crowds filled Trafalgar Square and the Mall, waving banners that read, "Long live the King," and Parliament has failed. It was as if centuries of restraint had finally snapped, unleashing something ancient and primal: loyalty to the crown itself. Starmer, desperate to regain control, went on live television that night. His face was pale, his voice strained. The monarchy, he said, must not interfere in the democratic process. But as he spoke, the nation seemed to turn away. He wasn't addressing Britain anymore, he was pleading with it. When the broadcast ended, even his allies admitted it felt like a farewell speech. In pubs, living rooms and online streams, viewers didn't discuss his words. They counted how many seconds of silence filled the gaps between them. The man who once promised a new dawn for Britain now looked like a relic of the very system he tried to reform. Then, at precisely 9 p.m, the palace finally broke its silence. A single statement appeared on its official website. His Majesty remains committed to the unity and stability of the United Kingdom. He will continue to act in accordance with his constitutional responsibilities. It was brief, measured, and absolutely devastating. Analysts immediately recognised the subtle message buried within it. By reaffirming unity and stability, the king was implying that the government had failed to uphold both. In just 2 sentences, he had dismantled the Prime Minister's authority without ever naming him. By dawn, the inevitable had happened. Leaks from the Labour Party confirmed that Starmer's own cabinet had turned against him. Rachel Reeves reportedly told colleagues that continuing under his leadership would be an act of madness. The press called it a royal reckoning. Outside Number 10, protesters chanted for his resignation while television crews captured every flicker of panic through the window. Hours later, at 11:17 a.m, the news broke. Keir Starmer had formally tendered his resignation to the king. For the first time in over 3 centuries, a sitting monarch had outlasted and effectively outmaneuvered his prime minister. But the story didn't end there, because just as the cameras turned to Buckingham Palace, a black car arrived at the gates. Inside was Nigel Farage, grinning faintly as he stepped into the royal courtyard. Reporters screamed questions, flashes lit up the sky, and one chilling thought raced across every British mind. Had the king just chosen his next prime minister? The gates closed behind him and the world held its breath. So now the question is, was this a quiet restoration of royal power, or the beginning of a new kind of Britain? Did the king just save democracy or rewrite it forever? And as Farage walked through those doors, did history just witness the most audacious power shift in modern times?